about some of our studio processes and some of the stuff that we've been up to. A lot of it actually sort of revolves around this word up on screen, redefinition. A little bit about us. We actually run 2 studios. One is based out of Bombay, which is the Busride Design Studio, and the other one based right here in Goa called the Busride Lab. And we work in a collaborative workspace in Goa, and the idea is to kind of constantly look at like to frame the design and the research practices as opposites, but constantly look for synergy. And actually, what we've been up to in practice in general, I think we value this one aspect a lot. So this is actually very, very close to the personality of the studio. We've been actually exceedingly polyvalent. We've been trying to dabble with a whole bunch of different kinds of projects, ranging from designing sets for Bollywood films, to working on design institutions, to working on restaurants, bars, clubs, pretty much the entire output of culture and its kind of built manifestation. And this polyvalence is something we actually guard quite jealously. It's something that we're actually trying to very actively inculcate in most studio processes. So around the topic of redefinition, which I kind of believe is at the heart of our contrarian personality, that also allows us to kind of turn briefs on their head. So there's a particular time in projects when you've actually gone through all the right brain stuff, and at the end when it just about comes into translation, there's a sort of a critical key phase at that time when one can actually redefine and one can actually completely change what the project mandates. And at that key moment is something that we actually try to actually put a lot of thought into it. The emerging paradigm of us, I think like in Nicoline's presentation, we're actually looking at a very, very large population who's actually looking at living in rooms as their experience of the city. And this is not purely an Indian phenomenon. This is across the world in most urban centers. For us, when we're actually given a brief of that kind, the first thing we try to do is to take off all the walls. And you start looking at populating a floor plan with intelligent objects. Like, how can you actually create a hyper-utilized, hyper-designed sort of an object that is inserted into a floor plan? And what happens really interestingly is these objects start talking to each other. So if you can actually map out the energy zones and what is required at different points in that floor plan, these objects kind of start becoming very, very interesting. And from our perspective, one of the things that, so that's a living room. And this is a project that we worked on, which is actually trying to understand every single functionality of what a living room does and compress the entire thing into a cube. And how it works is that on demand, the kind of living room unfolds. So you have essentially workstations, you have a TV unit in front, you have an entire fold-out library, and all of this collapses when it's not required. So we actually realize that objects have temporal qualities. Like, objects actually change their personality and change their functionality through the day. So the classic Simpsons kind of frame of a large couch, a family sitting on the couch looking at the television, that relationship only exists for 1 hour, 1.5 hours a day. So there's no reason for us to design our entire rooms based around that 1 hour relationship and then commit to that through the entire day. So this was a home project we worked on where actually each object has a lot of connection with objects around it. And that's a small animation that kind of shows you the functionality of the room. And it sort of collapses. So when you're entertaining, when your kids are playing around, you actually have a lot of free space. And the living room suddenly expands to fill up the rest of the space as well when required. The next one we actually tried to tackle for the same house was the idea of a couch. So what we did was we actually studied 21 different seating postures. Like, through the day today that you will also sit on many things apart from a chair. You will sit on a couch. You maybe, if you have an adventurous lifestyle, you may sit on a horse. You may actually crawl under a cave. There are multiple things that we do with our bodies and postures that are actually possible to abstract into a seating surface. And when you actually redefine a couch as being a surface to sit on, many things change. And the whole relationship with the object actually starts changing. So you have a position on the same topography that allows you to kind of have a private moment within the same house. If you're entertaining, you probably use the living space, which then has a very different sort of a setup. And what's interesting is that the kids in the house use this completely differently. So they use this as a play topography. They use it as a slide. It's a very, very active part of their day. And the sort of interaction with the kids actually showed us this really interesting thing, where we were also able to explore the underside of the couch. So there was a private consultation done with the kids of the house to understand what are the kind of different places that they want to travel to. And we actually crawled under the couch to actually hand draw the entire world map of all the places that they wanted to visit. So this place is strictly off limits to parents. It's only accessible to kids who can actually crawl into all these spaces. And so the couch works kind of interestingly as a centerpiece. And there's some more images on this house. So it's pretty much a shapeshifter home. And it's sort of the processes of compaction and urban living applied into creating almost a gallery-like experience. So the kids populate a jungle gym. They can actually change the, we actually realized that they were fighting about who's going to sleep up and who's going to sleep down in our interactions with them, and kind of realized that it's better to give them a kit so that they can kind of decide on a day-to-day basis where they want to sleep. That's the main door. It's like a sort of a cabinet which opens up. So there's space for the milk to be deposited. There's space for folded laundry to be kept in the door itself so that there are no regular doorbells in the house. So it kind of works at a more micro level. That home was a slightly larger home, but the same principles actually apply to a much, much smaller space. This is a typical Bombay apartment, and we tried to actually apply some of those principles, and that's in a much, much smaller size. And it works quite well as well. That's a small animation to show you how, on a much smaller scale, you can actually create a wardrobe, you can create a work area, you have things that move back, you have a small dining table that opens up for a couple who want to have a sort of an intimate dinner in a much smaller format. And if you had to actually push this one step further, this is a home that I lived in for 2 years. This is actually a single room. It's 160 square feet, but it's in this beautiful village in Bandra called Ranvar, which is a 400-year-old village. So I think the idea of luxury kind of you can turn it on its head, because the idea of living in that village was luxurious. The idea of having, walking out of your door and having someone say good morning to you, that itself was fantastic to experience in a city like Bombay. And this home actually is a shapeshifter. The bed on the right it's a king-size bed that actually splits into two to create a living room. The walls all move. And if you're wondering, the guy in the middle is supposed to be me when I'm 60, but I'm getting there much earlier. Essentially, you have like these sort of moving walls that open up. So you have a walk-in closet, you have a walk-in library, and you have a large workstation, which is a large softboard. That's Pamela Anderson way up there. This was before I got married. So that's a little bit about if you had to apply a slightly different thought process to living in rooms, it sort of translates to living amongst enlightened objects. And this sort of shift of perspective, it actually allows us to look at the shell of what we're given and not really commit to living in certain brackets that have been kind of provided to us. Sort of taking that into another domain, when we started work, a lot of our visible portfolio is in hospitality, so we do a lot of bars, clubs, restaurants, stuff like that. And we were working in this paradigm of very serious restauranting. Like if you were a serious restaurant, you had to spend serious money. That was one of the things that, you had to spend money on chandeliers, and you had to spend money on velvet, and, everything had to be kind of super plush. I'm talking about, around 12 years ago in India, when to be visible, you had to actually spend a lot of money. So what we actually decided to do was to actually take a different approach. We were happy to score a location in the same mall that this really, really crazy, opulent restaurants were, and they'd kind of spend upwards of 5 crores on their fit-outs. So what we actually decided to do was to paint our entire restaurant white, finish the basic cabinetry, paint everything white, and then sort of consume a lot of Red Bull, and over 35 days, take a black marker and sort of start drawing over the restaurant. That's me drawing the entire restaurant. And through this process, I think there was some really, really interesting insights that emerged. Like you actually start connecting with work a lot more. You start realizing when you make a mistake on an AutoCAD drawing, how that translates into site, because you're drawing over those mistakes. And it's kind of interesting that you can use this process of very, very visceral interaction with a project to actually start building on layers and narratives. And we were able to actually talk about ingredient. We were able to talk about the kind of music that's going to be playing in the restaurant. We were able to go, actually build an entire mind space of the person who's actually going to be the prime user of this space. And we were able to characterize this restaurant, make it a lot more personal. And through this project, I mean, it translated into this brand called Smokehouse Delhi, which is now a pan-India brand. And for each of the so maybe here it's interesting because we also worked on the playlist. So there's a lot of Afro-Cuban jazz that plays in the music. And if you actually are attentive, you'll hear the same song and you'll see the album cover illustrated on one of the cassette decks. So it's fairly detailed, and we try to take a 360 view to restauranting, trying to look at essentially what's the soul of a restaurant and why do people come there to spend time, and do you need to actually spend that money, right? For example, this restaurant cost us 250 rupees, which is 25 markers into 10. And that's roughly the fit-out budget for Smokehouse Delhi, including all wall treatments. So, and it's fairly detailed. I mean, actually what is not included in that cost is my flight tickets to fly from Bombay to Delhi to do touch-ups. That was painful. And so this also sort of got fairly detailed. We did 10 restaurants of these kind all over India. It was never supposed to be a scaled brand. It was supposed to be a one-off. And then, so every time they used to sign a new property, we used to be like, oh man, not again. But we were able to talk about really interesting things. Like that one is a reference to archigram because this is the same time when the mills were sort of in full force in Bombay, and when Bombay was spinning textiles to match Manchester. So there's a lot of Bombay and London connections going on. So we were able to reference art movements. We were able to represent kind of movements in architecture and really, really sort of indulge all our fetishes and all our kind of, individual kind of influences. That's interesting. If you look at the bottom image, there's a small QR code at the bottom of each illustration. This is a restaurant in BKC in Bandra, which is the business district in Bombay. And it's in the Citibank building. And what we did was we actually took each QR code refers to a scam that's happened in the building, right? So because you have Citibank and you have all these big banks in the same building, so if you zap that, and if you're a curious kind of person, you'd probably hyperlink to all these different scams that the city of Bombay has seen. And so I urge you next time, take your phone out and follow the links. And yeah, so that's some more pictures of Smokehouse Delhi. We did a lot of these. So we did, that's the one in Bangalore. And we actually, for the Bangalore one, we took an interesting challenge upon ourselves. We thought, let's find stories only on this one road. It's on Lavelle Road. So we said, let's not even think about Bangalore. Let's only look at Lavelle Road. Let's see how deep we can go into Lavelle Road. And the kind of stories that came up, that was unbelievable. Like the India's first UFO sighting happened on Lavelle Road in Bandra. So it's really, really crazy that the more you kind of indulge this research fetish, how deep you can actually go into unearthing really weird stuff that's happened. And if you had to strip down the layers of restauranting a step further, right? So what could one do which takes off even those frills? What we do is we run a zero-profit restaurant. So we actually took the profitability out of the picture, saying that the restaurant has to be something about more than making money. That's myself and a very close friend, Gresham. We run something called the Gypsy Kitchen, which is actually a not-for-profit. So what we do is we ask talented housewives, house help, grandmothers who need a secondary income. Essentially, the best chefs that we know around us are all in our own homes. And we actually we work with them very closely to curate a 12 to 13 course, fairly elaborate meal. And each meal costs you 2,500 rupees, and all the money from that night goes back to the person who's cooking. So it's a small micro-economy around food, which we run in a small, it's a dilapidated old bakery called Jude Bakery, and that's some pictures of the meal. So it's a completely no-frills meal. It's cooked in the same vessels that the homemaker is using. We actually make sure that she's on the table with the people dining, and we are the ones serving. So it's a small, essentially the meal is a thank you from the guests. The payment for the meal is a thank you from the guests who come and this thing. And what was really fascinating for us were these vignettes of memories that have happened at the Gypsy Kitchens. Conversations are incredible around that table. Like, to my mind, that's the soul of why people actually get into hospitality in the first place. These kind of conversations that happen over breaking bread and about eating a meal together. And invariably, you're able to talk about much larger urban issues. You're able to talk about conservation. Because it's a food and design project, we also end up documenting recipes, and we're able to kind of move recipes from generation to generation. So this really opens up the question of what can a restaurant be? Like, what should a restaurant be? And these are things that we're still kind of framing answers to in the studio. What I'd like to take you through a little bit now is some of the lab work, because the design studio work is kind of fairly easy to understand, and it's kind of more visual. It's more in the public domain, and it's very, very polyvalent. So right from looking at the different domains of work, but we wanted to bring that same polyvalence and same sort of thinking into research, which is normally a very, very straight-jacketed, long, linear process. We thought, what if we can actually bring all that fun and randomness into research as well? And the idea was to articulate a very strong Indian voice, because when we talk about futures or we talk about research, we're actually faced with a lot of Silicon Valley thinking. We're faced with a lot of narratives from the West. And I believe that anyone who spent more than an hour in India realizes that this is a country that's like no other. It's completely chaotic. I mean, it's going to urbanize like no one else has ever urbanized in the past. So I think articulating a uniquely Indian voice around futures was very, very key for us in the research lab. And we're trying to see what we could do. So I'll just take you through a few of the strange things. That's actually, I don't know, probably the ugliest statue that's ever been made. Right, so, but there's a situation that, so this is something called the Statue of Unity, which is around a 3,000 crore project. This was put up in Gujarat recently. And it brings to mind many, many questions, right? So the idea of building statues is really not under question. I mean, as a species, as humans, we've been building statues for the last 35,000 years, right? The first statue was in Germany 35,000 years ago. And from figurines to monumental statues, we've been actually seeing a massive progression in how we as a species express ourselves. What was actually slightly strange about these new statues in India were that they were at great public cost. It's all taxpayers' money, and one actually questions the validity of these monuments on our skylines, right? If you had to put that same 3,000 crores into, say, Kyoorius, right? That's what, 200 times your turnover, right? Right, so imagine 200 extra conferences, 200 times like, I mean, that's the kind of numbers that one is talking about, right? So it really calls into question where the spend is going. We started wondering about, so if we had a piece of that pie, like what would we do? And what we have a very strong belief in the studio saying that statues represent public opinion. They are actually representative of democracies. They're publicly elected officials who are able to actually find great political will, able to find resources, able to find skill to actually put up these monuments. But what if they're not only ornamental? What if they're not only symbols of politics, but they can also be performative? Like, how can that statue actually become useful for the city? So the next step for us was, if the statue represents one bad idea on the side of a government, let's at least come up with 100 good ideas to counter that. Right? So if you look at India, India is actually the 5th largest e-waste producer in the world. And this is only growing with the kind of scenario. So a lot of our extrapolations are actually based in data. We start pulling out data which is relevant, and then start creating statues based on that data. So that's actually Gandhi and attached to an e-waste mine. So essentially what happens is e-waste is actually circulated within the base of the statue, and as gold is rescued from PCBs, the statue gets gold-plated. So it's a sort of a gradual process, and the city can see how many, it's a real-time data visualization of how many how the e-waste is being mined. The second situation actually looks at around India's very, very vast and expansive renewable energy program. So we thought like Gandhi's dhoti is a great place to put a turbine. So you can actually have a very, very strong wind flowing through the statue. At the base harvests kind of tidal energy. And you could actually have these kind of offshore facilities which represent a much better use of funds. Then after that, we went a bit crazy. So we started doing like a whole bunch of these kind of projects. The desalination becomes a low-hanging fruit. Like the seated Gandhi becomes a great place to put a desalination plant in. Lots of Indian cities are actually facing crazy water shortages, and desalination, which is a very expensive option right now, but it may actually be our only way to create drinking water in cities. It gets more interesting where there's like a offshore aquatic park and a coral reef scaffolding. There's affordable housing. There's also, that's interesting, this is Kasturba. We actually realized that we were doing a lot of male statues for some reason. So we started like looking at female icons. That's Kasturba Gandhi, the better known Gandhi's wife. And we actually started figuring out if this statue could actually house Bombay's data needs, right? Because right now all our data is stored in all across the US, and we ship our data through transatlantic cables across. But eventually cities are going to get more mindful of their data sovereignty, and we want to control your data and where it's stored physically. So if this was a massive offshore server farm, which is underwater because it cools better, and then you have two algorithms that are actually controlling the city's municipality, and they're playing Pac-Man on the sort of scala. And so essentially, it's a high-frequency game of Pac-Man, and the algorithm that wins actually then gets to control Bombay for the next week. Then you have the Ambedkar solar locomotives. So it's a mural that gets assembled every night when the trains come into dock. And in the day, the trains are out kind of servicing. I could go on, but they get more and more random. So that's an offshore cemetery, and that's Shahid Bhagat Singh grain silo to store our sovereign grain stock. And this one's my favorite, actually. This is an Ambedkar docking station for drones. So essentially what happens is you have a large statue which through the day is kind of picking up solar power, and in the day your drones leave to kind of so they you have drones servicing the city all over the place, fixing potholes, delivering parcels, and at night they come back and create this type of statue. So that segues into the next thing. I feel one of the things that we can actually look to turn on its head is how we solve problems, right? This is one of those very, very big things that the past has shown us in exquisite beauty how to solve problems, but we end up pissing on those learnings to a large extent. So I'll just take one problem of aridity, which is essentially when groundwater depletes and aquifers dry up. And this is happening real time in many Indian cities today. And from here, I'd like to take you to Rajasthan. So this is actually something called the Chand Bauri, which is a very, very interesting story. These are step wells, and they exist all the way from India to Kabul in a large belt, almost 5,000-6,000 of these documented step wells. They exist from a small home-scale step well to a large community-based step well. And there are some very, very interesting principles at play here. In the Chand Bauri, religion is used as a water filtration system. Right, so you have a temple which is kept right at the bottom near the water so that people don't defecate or don't urinate into the water. You have cool spaces. The temperature drops by almost 4 degrees as you go down closer. So it's a very, very hot region. The sort of step well fills up in the monsoons, and the well is always accessible because there are always exposed levels where you can walk down to reach the water. It's actually one of the most beautiful solutions that we've come up with as a culture in the past. And to my mind, this represents a beautiful problem. It's something that is a very, very distinct topical solution. And it's a beautiful problem which has met a beautiful solution. But if you look at what we do today, that's really how we're solving our energy needs today, right? There are massive land grabs. And this is not too kind of inherent to India. I mean, Tesla is doing the same thing in the US, in Nevada, where you have these massive factories. The big difference is that community, beauty, culture is all kept out in the deployment of technology. I think as a culture, we've lost the relationship of culture, craft, beauty with technology. Technology is now creating shapes and forms of its own, and beauty and culture and all are left for the galleries and for essentially converted audiences like this, right? And that's, if you look at green energy, if one is talking about green energy, that's how green energy is, because these panels have to be cleaned daily by illegal water, by pipe, which is sourced from villages. This is actually the Adani field in South India. This is the largest solar field in India. And that's the a file picture of how the solar panels are cleaned, because if the panels are not cleaned every day, there's a 25% drop in productivity. So, and obviously the company doesn't do this illegal stuff. They subcontract it to other contractors. So everyone's happy. And I feel answers to this kind of dilemma lie in our past. And it's just a matter of reframing these questions, right? So what better way to build a sun temple than using solar panels, right? So in fact, if you look at the sun temple in Konark, the etymology of the word Konark actually comes from sun and corner. Kona means corner and ark is sun. It's actually almost like someone in the year 1250 was telling us that idiots build using solar panels, like it's one of those things. So we actually started working with a few illustrators to start visualizing what these future temples could look like. And that's our version of what a future solar temple could look like. The idea is to kind of integrate subcultures, kind of almost do like our own Burning Man in Rajasthan, where you have a big party going on inside, sunlight is being harvested in the day, a lot of active cultural interactions with this thing, and also representing the sort of built beauty. And you can actually have small observation platforms like chhatris that exist out in between the solar panels and sort of create a very, very different kind of expression of technology. And what's really interesting is, in this case, beauty becomes the generator. Like, one can actually consider that the sort of close correlation of religion and beauty, and how one may not have predated the other. The idea of building something beautiful actually encourages stewardship. It actually encourages people to come visit that place more often. And maybe religions flowered because of this beautiful expression of culture and craft. The last thing I'd like to talk to you about is the notion of time. Right? So I feel in an Indian context, we have a lot to offer. And we actually, if we had to reframe our relationship with time, if we had to create a more healthier marriage, a lot of other stuff falls into place. And this is one of the focus points of our research right now in Goa. We look at, say, the Western notion of time actually is a sort of a progression from, we in our heads imagine that the past is behind us, the future is in front of us, and we're on this static journey, very slow, peaceful journey from the past to the future. And we are actually dots on that journey, and we're kind of progressing naturally on that. The Eastern conceptions of time actually imagine it as cyclical. So when you look at essentially everything that has happened now will happen again. But to my mind, both these are not enabling definitions. Like, they don't allow me to actually do anything about it. Like, in both these, I'm very passive. I'm actually being taken on a roller coaster ride, and there's very limited agency. So this is when, this is the kind of random knowledge that you find spouting from churches in Bandra. Like, you'll have this sort of a thing that really strikes a new chord and a new kind of thought process. And we started looking at stories as generators of time. So to some people, this may be familiar. It's an illustration of the Samudra Manthan, which is this beautiful story from Indian mythology. So what we started doing was, because we're geeks, we started diagramming it. So I'll draw your attention to the diagram on the right. At the bottom, you have, so essentially this whole mad thing was set in motion by a sage called Durvasu, who actually was really pissed off with the gods, and he actually took away all their powers. And that's how the story begins. All the action is actually happening in, that's essentially the base of the story is the river of milk, into which there's a mountain, which is Mount Mandar, is inserted into the river of milk. And there's a churn that happens. So essentially what happens is there's a divine snake called Vasuki who's wrapped around the mountain 3 times. And you have this sort of a collaborative effort between the gods and the demons who are pulling the snake from both the sides. And you have this massive churn happening in the ocean of milk. And you have the whole thing witnessed on top by Shiva, who's actually waiting to take in all the poison that's coming out from this churn. So the churn actually took out poison, and it took out Amrit, which is the nectar of life. But the idea is that Amrit came out right in the end. So there's a lot of other shit that comes out in the process. Shiva was there to kind of receive it and hold it in his throat, which is how he becomes the Neelkant, which is his throat turns blue because of holding the poison, halahal. You also have Mohini, which in my mind is perfectly for design. It's the seductress. It's essentially a god who's dressed as the most beautiful woman in the world, who's actually able to distract the asuras so that the devas can steal the Amrit. That's perfectly, for the design audience. Kind of pretty pictures. And essentially, in the end, Amrit emerges. What's really, really interesting about this story is the snake is time. So the metaphorical snake, which is Vasuki, which is wrapped 3 times around the mountain of Mandar, which is each coil represents the past, the present, and the future. This is the definition of time in Indian mythology, and to my mind, it's fantastic because time is a churn, right? Time is a constant negotiation, and time creates adjacencies. Now, these 3 attributes, which are virtues for time, are actually devoid, which are taken out of our imagination when we think about time on our watches or in a more static sense. So the fact that time can actually have embodied virtue and time can actually have embodied grammar is very, very interesting for us. And I feel in the studio, this talks a lot to our work because this actually allows us to look at time in a much more liberating way. We're actually able to see adjacencies in heritage, in craft, in new tech. For example, virtual reality can talk directly to a 400-year-old monument, and there's no conflict, there's no sense, because we know that every experiment in this domain is one more churn, and it's a very, very enabling definition. So how we've been trying to map this churn is we've been putting the year 2035 in the middle somewhere, and this is a project I've been doing for the last 4.5 years. Like, the idea is to build an oracle, which is essentially a culture map of the year 2035. And this maps adjacencies. So the idea is that we can actually map out, like, say, gender trends along with rise in AI, along with emerging tech, along with architecture, along with algorithmic cults, all kinds of stuff. So we're kind of parking all of this in this large culture map. And that's actually some work we've been doing in Goa. So the idea is that we actually take 400-year-old endangered monuments. We fly drones over them to actually start creating photogrammetric data. This data actually forms point clouds, which we then take into virtual reality to create sort of highly realistic renditions of what those monuments are like. We then start engaging with ruins like this, which is actually, with even a slight tour of Goa, you'll realize that these are in almost every village. You have this age-old, beautiful monument that's kind of waiting for some sort of interesting intervention. And some of what we tried to do is to create protective scaffoldings for the monuments, but use the scaffoldings as live materials. So sometimes taking out plants and taking out jungle actually erodes the quality of that monument. So what we try to do is to guide the jungle into creating a cathedral-like volume. And we're also trying to use photogrammetry to create a digital repatriation, because what happens is Goa is a very thriving antiques market. A lot of these objects have actually left Goa and gone abroad. But we can actually repatriate these objects, put them back in context using VR. So we can actually create a virtual reality rendition of what this choir would sound like, what the church would be like, and repatriate these objects, put them back into context. Some of the work we do is also fundraising. So we actually create small dolls houses of all these monuments. And these are sold using activist groups. They're sold at various different touch points in Goa to raise money for awareness programs, to raise money for conservation efforts. There's some more random stuff. We actually trying to create future heirlooms. So we're trying to code a lot of current day process into things like carving. So that's actually a heirloom cabinet which was designed by us, and that features VR glasses, robotic arms. So the idea is that if someone in 100 years' time finds this in a junk market, they'll kind of know where we were in 2019. That's some other work. We're trying to actually train a few machine learning loops on Indian art and craft. So we're trying to see how would a machine design a chair, for example. So this is actually a work in progress, long-term sort of an experiment that's going on. We're also doing something really strange called Mughlai, which is actually Mughal meets AI. So it's sort of trying to so we're trying to run sort of machine learning loops on old Mughal miniature paintings to see what the machine comes up with. It's obviously just garbled right now, but the idea is to kind of do a lot more work in this domain. A lot of our recent work is actually around the future of craft. So we actually are trying to build procedural models in sort of new software and trying to find a bridge between that visualization and traditional basket weaving in Goa. So the idea is to kind of start a small renaissance program around traditional craft. And what has really sort of helped these kind of things is really to arrive at a more enabling definition of time. Like, we don't look at ourselves as practitioners in the present who are only looking for inspiration. We're actually looking to actively build bridges between these two worlds, about actually emerging tech with age-old craft. and hopefully we achieve a much better expression of culture. So, yeah, thank you.